Hello there, fellow seekers of the mysterious and unexplained. Tonight, we're going to delve into one of history's most chilling and enduring mysteries, a tale that blends ancient Egyptian magic with modern tragedy, archaeological triumph with supernatural terror, and scientific discovery with inexplicable death. So please, settle yourself comfortably wherever you are tonight. Perhaps dim the lights and draw your blanket a little closer, and let me know in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is in your corner of the world. Are you listening from a cozy bedroom in Dublin as autumn rain taps against your window? Perhaps from a quiet apartment in Vancouver as the first snow of winter begins to fall? Maybe you're in a small town in New Mexico, watching the desert stars emerge in the clear night sky. Wherever you are, you're about to discover that the ancient Egyptians may have left behind more than just golden treasures and magnificent monuments, that their tombs may contain protective forces so powerful and so malevolent that they continue to claim lives thousands of years after the pharaohs were laid to rest. If this exploration into the supernatural legacy of ancient Egypt helps you drift into peaceful sleep while pondering the mysteries that still defy explanation, perhaps consider subscribing for more journeys through history's most enigmatic tales. And don't forget to like this video if it carries you gently into the realm of dreams. Think ghost stories are just folklore? Think ancient curses are mere superstition? Imagine discovering that every major excavation of an Egyptian tomb has been followed by a trail of mysterious deaths, bizarre accidents, and supernatural phenomena that modern science cannot explain. Imagine learning that the archaeologists who opened King Tutankhamun's tomb experienced a pattern of premature deaths so consistent and so strange that even skeptical researchers began to wonder if something beyond coincidence was at work. Imagine realizing that for over a century, those brave enough to disturb the eternal rest of Egypt's ancient rulers have paid a price that extends far beyond the usual occupational hazards of archaeology, encountering forces that seem to reach across millennia to protect the sacred boundaries between the living and the dead. This is the true story of the curse of the pharaohs, a phenomenon so well documented and so consistently deadly that it has transformed our understanding of what may lie waiting in the darkness of ancient tombs. Picture, if you will, Egypt in the early 20th century, when the great age of archaeological discovery was reaching its zenith and Europeans with more enthusiasm than experience were racing to uncover the treasures of the pharaohs. This was an era when archaeology was still more treasure hunting than scientific investigation, when wealthy collectors and ambitious museums competed to fill their halls with golden artifacts torn from their ancient contexts. The Valley of the Kings, that desolate stretch of desert on the west bank of the Nile near Luxor, had become a battleground where rival expeditions fought for the right to excavate tombs that had lain undisturbed for thousands of years. Into this competitive and chaotic environment stepped Howard Carter, a British archaeologist whose meticulous methods and obsessive dedication would soon make him the most famous tomb discoverer in history. Carter had spent decades working in Egypt, developing an intimate knowledge of ancient burial practices and an almost supernatural ability to locate hidden chambers in the seemingly barren landscape of the Valley of the Kings. But Carter's greatest discovery would also become the source of his greatest torment, as the tomb he was about to uncover would unleash a series of events so strange and so terrifying that they would change forever how humanity viewed the relationship between ancient magic and modern science. The story of the Pharaohs' Curse begins on November 4, 1922, when Carter's workmen uncovered the first step of what would prove to be the entrance to the tomb of Tutankhamun, the boy pharaoh whose brief reign had ended over 3,000 years earlier. Unlike most royal tombs in the Valley of the Kings, which had been thoroughly plundered by ancient grave robbers, Tutankhamun's burial chamber had remained virtually intact, sealed behind multiple barriers and hidden beneath debris from later construction projects. But even before Carter and his patron Lord Carnarvon had fully excavated the tomb's entrance, strange events began to occur that should have served as warnings of what was to come. Carter's pet canary, which had been a constant companion during his years of excavation work, was found dead in its cage just hours after the discovery of the tomb's first step. Local workers, already nervous about disturbing the ancient burial ground, reported that the bird had been killed by a cobra, the sacred serpent that appeared on the pharaoh's crown and was believed to protect the royal dead from desecration. The superstitious Egyptian workers saw the canary's death as an omen, a clear sign that the pharaoh's protective spirits were already mobilizing to defend their master's rest. They begged Carter to abandon the excavation and reseal the tomb before something even worse could happen. But Carter, driven by a combination of scientific curiosity and the prospect of archaeological immortality, dismissed their concerns as primitive superstition and ordered the work to continue. On November 26, 1922, Carter broke through the sealed doorway of Tutankhamun's tomb and became the first human being in over 3 millennia to look upon the treasures of the boy pharaoh. When Lord Carnarvon asked if he could see anything in the darkness beyond the breach, Carter uttered the famous words that would echo through archaeological history, "Yes, wonderful things. But among those wonderful things may have been forces that were never meant to be disturbed by modern hands." The first victim of what would come to be known as the Curse of the Pharaohs was Lord Carnarvon himself, the wealthy British aristocrat who had funded Carter's excavations and had been present at the opening of the tomb. Just 5 months after the discovery, Carnarvon was dead, killed by what doctors described as an infected mosquito bite that had developed into pneumonia. But the circumstances surrounding his death were so strange that even medical professionals struggled to explain what had actually happened to the previously healthy 57-year-old peer. Carnarvon had indeed been bitten by a mosquito while in Egypt, but the bite had been minor and should have healed without complications. Instead, the wound became infected with unprecedented severity, developing into a systemic infection that resisted all medical treatment. Even more mysteriously, Carnarvon began experiencing symptoms that had nothing to do with mosquito bites or pneumonia. He complained of hearing voices calling his name in ancient Egyptian, of seeing shadowy figures moving through his hotel room at night, and of feeling an overwhelming sense of dread whenever he thought about the tomb. The night of Carnarvon's death was marked by a series of supernatural occurrences that witnesses found impossible to explain. At the exact moment of his passing, all the lights in Cairo went out, plunging the city into darkness for several minutes before mysteriously returning to normal. The power company could find no technical explanation for the outage, which seemed to have occurred spontaneously and resolved itself without human intervention. Even more disturbing was what happened back in England at Carnarvon's estate. At the precise moment of his death in Egypt, his favorite dog, Susie, began howling uncontrollably and then died suddenly without any apparent cause. The dog had been in perfect health and showed no signs of illness before her mysterious death, which occurred thousands of miles away from her master but at the exact time of his passing, as if some supernatural force had connected their fates across the vast distance. But Lord Carnarvon was only the beginning of a death toll that would eventually claim dozens of lives connected to the excavation of Tutankhamun's tomb. The pattern of deaths that followed was so consistent and so bizarre that even the most skeptical observers began to wonder if some malevolent force was systematically eliminating those who had dared to disturb the pharaoh's eternal rest. Arthur Mace, the American archaeologist who had helped Carter break through the sealed door of the tomb, died just 2 years after the discovery. Like Carnarvon, Mace was a relatively young and healthy man who succumbed to a mysterious illness that doctors could not adequately explain. Mace complained of constant fatigue and a sense of being watched, symptoms that had no apparent medical cause but which grew progressively worse until his death in 1928. George J. Gould, an American railroad executive who visited the tomb shortly after its opening, died of a fever just months after his trip to Egypt. Gould had been in excellent health before his visit and had no history of the tropical diseases that might explain his sudden illness. His death was particularly disturbing because he had only spent a few hours inside the tomb, yet he died with the same mysterious symptoms that had characterized Carnarvon's final days. Colonel Aubrey Herbert, Carnarvon's half-brother, died under circumstances that defied medical explanation. Herbert had not been directly involved in the excavation but had visited the tomb to see the discoveries that had made his brother famous. Within months of his visit, Herbert began experiencing severe vision problems that progressed to total blindness, followed by a mysterious blood poisoning that killed him despite the best medical care available in London. The deaths continued with horrifying regularity, each one marked by symptoms that seemed to have no natural cause and each one connected, however tangentially, to the opening of Tutankhamun's tomb. Archibald Douglas Reed, the radiologist who X-rayed Tutankhamun's mummy, died suddenly of an undiagnosed illness just days after completing his work. Sir Bruce Ingham, who had received a mummified hand from Carter as a gift, saw his house burn down immediately after the hand arrived, and then died in the subsequent fire under circumstances that investigators could never fully explain. The pattern was so consistent that newspapers around the world began tracking what they called the curse deaths, maintaining lists of victims and speculating about the supernatural forces that seemed to be protecting the boy pharaoh's tomb. By 1935, just 13 years after the tomb's opening, over 20 people directly connected to the excavation had died under mysterious circumstances, most of them far younger than the average life expectancy of their time and social class. But the curse seemed to extend beyond simple death to encompass a broader pattern of misfortune and supernatural harassment that plagued anyone who had been involved in disturbing Tutankhamun's rest. Richard Bethel, Carter's personal secretary and one of the first people to enter the tomb, reported being haunted by nightmares and supernatural visitations that made normal life impossible. Bethel described seeing ancient Egyptian figures in his bedroom, hearing chanting in languages he did not understand, and experiencing sudden temperature drops that seemed to follow him wherever he went. Bethel's father, Lord Westbury, became so convinced that his son was cursed that he threw himself from the window of his London apartment, leaving behind a suicide note that attributed his despair to his son's involvement in unholy activities in Egypt. Lord Westbury's funeral procession was disrupted when the hearse broke down unexpectedly, and the coffin fell into the street, an event that local newspapers interpreted as further evidence of the curse's reach. Howard Carter himself, despite being the primary architect of the tomb's violation, seemed to be protected from the curse's deadliest effects, though he did not escape entirely unscathed. Carter lived until 1939, 17 years after opening the tomb, but his later life was marked by professional ostracism, financial difficulties, and health problems that many attributed to supernatural retribution. Carter frequently complained of feeling watched and followed, and he developed an obsessive fear of Egyptian artifacts that made it difficult for him to continue his archaeological work. The most disturbing aspect of Carter's experience was his gradual transformation from a confident and ambitious archaeologist into a paranoid and broken man who became convinced that he had awakened forces beyond human understanding. In his private journals, which were not published until decades after his death, Carter described a growing sense that something had followed him home from Egypt, something that was waiting for the right moment to complete its revenge. Carter wrote about objects in his house moving on their own, about hearing footsteps in empty rooms, and about seeing shadowy figures that disappeared when he tried to look at them directly. He described waking up at night to find ancient Egyptian hieroglyphs carved into the walls of his bedroom, symbols that would vanish by morning but leave behind a sense of menace that haunted him for days. Most terrifying of all were Carter's accounts of dreams in which he found himself back in Tutankhamun's tomb, but not as an archaeologist or explorer. In these recurring nightmares, Carter was a prisoner, trapped forever in the pharaoh's burial chamber as punishment for his violation of the sacred space. He would wake from these dreams with the taste of sand in his mouth and the sound of ancient Egyptian funeral chants echoing in his ears. The supernatural phenomena associated with the curse of the pharaohs were not limited to the immediate participants in the tomb's excavation. Museums that displayed artifacts from Tutankhamun's burial chamber reported a consistent pattern of strange occurrences that defied rational explanation. Night watchmen described seeing ghostly figures moving through the Egyptian galleries, hearing voices speaking in ancient languages, and experiencing sudden temperature changes that seemed to center around the pharaoh's artifacts. The British Museum, which housed several items from the tomb, was forced to hire additional security after a series of incidents involving visitors who claimed to have been physically attacked by invisible forces while viewing the Egyptian collection. One woman reported being pushed down a flight of stairs by unseen hands while leaving the Egyptian wing, while another described feeling strangled by invisible fingers when she tried to photograph a piece of jewelry from the tomb. Even more disturbing were the reports from conservators and curators who worked directly with the artifacts. Several staff members at the British Museum resigned after experiencing what they described as supernatural harassment that made it impossible for them to continue their work. They reported tools moving on their own, ancient voices whispering warnings in their ears, and a constant sense of being watched by malevolent presences that seemed to emanate from the pharaoh's treasures. The Cairo Museum, which housed the majority of Tutankhamun's burial goods, became notorious among staff and visitors for supernatural activity that seemed to intensify whenever new artifacts were added to the collection. Guards reported seeing lights moving through the galleries at night when no human was present, and several resigned after claiming to have been physically attacked by forces they could not see or understand. Dr. Gamal Merez, the director of antiquities at the Cairo Museum, publicly dismissed the curse as superstition and coincidence, arguing that the deaths and strange events could be explained by natural causes and psychological suggestion. But Dr. Merez himself died suddenly of a heart attack just hours after giving a television interview in which he mocked the curse and challenged it to harm him if it was real. He was 52 years old and had no history of heart disease. The scientific community struggled to find rational explanations for the consistent pattern of deaths and supernatural phenomena associated with Egyptian tomb excavations. Some researchers suggested that ancient toxins or bacteria preserved in the sealed tombs might be responsible for the mysterious illnesses that claimed so many lives. Others proposed that psychological stress and suggestion could account for the strange experiences reported by those involved in the excavations. But even the most dedicated skeptics found it difficult to explain away the sheer statistical improbability of so many premature deaths among a relatively small group of people, or the consistency of the supernatural phenomena reported by independent witnesses across different countries and decades. The medical records of curse victims showed a pattern of symptoms that did not correspond to any known disease or toxin, while the supernatural experiences were too specific and too consistent to be dismissed as mere hysteria or suggestion. Dr. Caroline Strang, a British physician who studied the medical records of curse victims in the 1960s, concluded that the deaths showed characteristics that could not be explained by any known pathological process. The victims died of symptoms that resembled ancient Egyptian descriptions of divine punishment, including mysterious fevers, sudden blindness, and organ failure that occurred without any identifiable cause. Even more puzzling was the timing of the deaths, which seemed to follow patterns that corresponded to ancient Egyptian religious calendars and burial rituals. Several victims died on dates that held special significance in pharaonic religion, while others experienced their most severe symptoms during Egyptian festivals dedicated to the protection of the dead. The curse seemed to operate according to rules that reflected ancient Egyptian beliefs about the afterlife and divine justice. Those who had shown the greatest disrespect for Egyptian religious traditions suffered the most severe consequences, while those who had approached the excavations with reverence and cultural sensitivity seemed to be protected from the worst effects of supernatural retribution. This pattern was particularly evident in the fate of Egyptian workers who had participated in the excavations. Despite their direct involvement in opening the tombs, the local workers experienced significantly fewer supernatural problems than their European colleagues. Several Egyptian foremen and laborers worked on tomb excavations for decades without experiencing the mysterious deaths and supernatural harassment that plagued foreign archaeologists. The explanation for this protection seemed to lie in the workers' cultural background and religious practices. Unlike the European excavators, who viewed the tombs primarily as sources of archaeological data and valuable artifacts, the Egyptian workers maintained a deep respect for the ancient religious beliefs that the tombs represented. They performed traditional protective rituals before entering burial chambers, left offerings for the deceased pharaohs, and treated the ancient dead with the reverence that Egyptian culture had maintained for thousands of years. This cultural dimension of the curse suggested that the supernatural forces at work were not simply random or malevolent, but operated according to a moral logic that reflected ancient Egyptian concepts of divine justice and religious propriety. The curse seemed to distinguish between those who approached the tombs with respect and those who viewed them merely as sources of treasure or scientific data. The most dramatic evidence for this interpretation came from the experiences of Ahmed Jirigar, the Egyptian foreman who discovered the entrance to Tutankhamun's tomb. Unlike Carter and the other European excavators, Jirigar lived a long and prosperous life, dying peacefully in his sleep at the age of 94. Throughout his later years, Jirigar attributed his protection from the curse to his adherence to traditional Egyptian customs and his sincere respect for the pharaoh's spiritual authority. Jirigar described performing protective rituals before each day's work in the tomb, including prayers to the ancient gods and offerings of food and incense. He treated Tutankhamun not as a historical curiosity but as a still powerful spiritual presence who deserved the same respect that had been accorded to pharaohs in life. This reverent approach seemed to provide protection that European scientific skepticism could not match. The protection enjoyed by culturally sensitive participants in the excavations extended to some foreign researchers who made efforts to understand and respect Egyptian religious traditions. Dr. Derry, the anatomist who performed the autopsy on Tutankhamun's mummy, lived to a ripe old age despite his intimate involvement with the pharaoh's remains. Colleagues noted that Dr. Derry had studied ancient Egyptian religious practices and had performed his work with a reverence that acknowledged the spiritual significance of what he was doing. But perhaps the most compelling evidence for the reality of the Pharaoh's Curse came from the experiences of those who attempted to remove artifacts from Egypt entirely, taking them far from the pharaoh's homeland and the protective rituals that Egyptian culture provided. These individuals seemed to experience the most severe and persistent supernatural harassment, as if the distance from Egypt had somehow intensified the curse's effects rather than diminishing them. The case of the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York provides a particularly well-documented example of how the curse seemed to follow Egyptian artifacts wherever they went. The museum's Egyptian collection, which included several items acquired during the early 20th century tomb excavations, became the site of numerous supernatural incidents that forced museum officials to implement special security measures and staff support systems. Night guards at the Metropolitan Museum reported a consistent pattern of supernatural activity in the Egyptian wing, including unexplained sounds, moving shadows, and sudden temperature changes that seemed to center around artifacts from pharaonic tombs. Several guards resigned after experiencing what they described as physical attacks by invisible forces, while others reported seeing ancient Egyptian figures moving through the galleries when the museum was closed to the public. The museum's conservation staff experienced similar problems when working with Egyptian artifacts. Tools would disappear and reappear in impossible locations. Conservation chemicals would change color and consistency without explanation, and electronic equipment would malfunction whenever staff attempted to analyze or photograph certain pieces from tomb excavations. Most disturbing of all were the incidents involving museum visitors, who seemed to be affected by supernatural forces that emanated from the Egyptian collection. Several visitors reported feeling suddenly ill when viewing pharaonic artifacts, while others described being pushed or grabbed by invisible hands while walking through the Egyptian galleries. One woman claimed to have been possessed by an ancient Egyptian spirit while viewing a sarcophagus, speaking in hieroglyphic phrases that she did not understand but which Egyptologists later confirmed were authentic ancient funeral curses. The pattern of supernatural activity at the Metropolitan Museum was not unique. Similar incidents were reported at museums around the world that housed artifacts from Egyptian tomb excavations, creating a global network of haunted institutions that seemed to be connected by the curse's invisible threads. The British Museum's Egyptian collection became notorious for supernatural phenomena that seemed to intensify whenever new artifacts were added to the display. The museum was forced to install special environmental controls and security systems after a series of incidents that conventional security measures could not address. The Louvre's Egyptian wing experienced similar problems, with guards reporting ghostly figures that appeared to be ancient Egyptian priests or nobles moving through the galleries at night. These apparitions were described as solid and real-looking, but they would vanish whenever guards tried to approach them or call for backup. Even more puzzling were the reports from conservators who worked on Egyptian artifacts at various museums. They described a consistent pattern of supernatural interference that seemed designed to prevent or complicate their work. Ancient artifacts would develop mysterious damage overnight, conservation treatments would fail for no apparent reason, and electronic analysis equipment would malfunction in ways that technicians could not explain or repair. The supernatural phenomena associated with Egyptian artifacts were not limited to museums and archaeological sites. Private collectors who acquired pharaonic treasures reported similar experiences of supernatural harassment that seemed to follow the artifacts wherever they went. The case of Lord Carnarvon's collection provides a particularly well-documented example of how the curse seemed to pursue Egyptian artifacts into private hands. After Carnarvon's death, his family attempted to sell his collection of Egyptian antiquities, but potential buyers were frightened away by reports of supernatural activity that seemed to intensify whenever the artifacts were moved or handled. Several collectors who purchased items from Carnarvon's estate reported experiencing immediate supernatural problems that forced them to return or dispose of their acquisitions. One American millionaire who bought a set of canopic jars from Tutankhamun's tomb reported that his house became uninhabitable due to supernatural activity that included moving objects, strange sounds, and apparitions of ancient Egyptian figures. The millionaire eventually donated the canopic jars to a museum, but the supernatural activity in his house continued for months after the artifacts were removed. as if the curse had taken up permanent residence in the building where the stolen treasures had been housed. Private collectors who attempted to keep Egyptian artifacts in their homes often found that the supernatural harassment extended to their families and employees. Children reported seeing ghostly Egyptian figures in their bedrooms, while domestic staff resigned after experiencing physical attacks by invisible forces. Dogs and cats seemed particularly sensitive to the presence of cursed artifacts, often refusing to enter rooms where Egyptian treasures were displayed and exhibiting signs of extreme fear and agitation when forced to approach them. The most dramatic case of supernatural retaliation against private collectors involved a British businessman who acquired a collection of shaptis, small funerary figurines that were buried with pharaohs to serve them in the afterlife. Within weeks of bringing the shaptis into his home, the collector's family began experiencing supernatural phenomena that escalated from minor annoyances to life-threatening attacks. The family reported that the shaptis seemed to come alive at night, moving around the house and performing household tasks in a grotesque parody of their intended function. Family members would wake to find furniture rearranged, food prepared in the kitchen, and strange hieroglyphic messages written on mirrors and windows. The supernatural activity intensified until the family was forced to flee their home, abandoning their possessions and eventually selling the house at a significant loss to buyers who were unaware of its supernatural history. The new owners of the house experienced similar supernatural problems until they discovered the shaptis hidden in the basement and arranged for their return to Egypt through proper archaeological channels. Only after the cursed artifacts were removed and returned to their homeland did the supernatural activity finally cease. The pattern of supernatural retaliation against those who removed Egyptian artifacts from their proper context suggests that the curse was not simply a random malevolent force, but operated according to a complex moral and spiritual logic that reflected ancient Egyptian beliefs about the proper treatment of the dead and their burial goods. Ancient Egyptian religion placed enormous emphasis on the importance of maintaining the integrity of burial sites and ensuring that the dead were provided with everything they needed for their journey through the afterlife. Removing artifacts from tombs was not just theft in the modern sense, but a form of spiritual violence that condemned the deceased to suffer in the afterlife by depriving them of the tools and treasures they needed for eternal life. This religious context helps explain why the curse seemed to operate according to rules that distinguished between different types of violation and different levels of disrespect. Those who studied Egyptian artifacts with scholarly reverence and cultural sensitivity seemed to be protected from the worst effects of supernatural retaliation, while those who treated pharaonic treasures as mere curiosities or commercial commodities experienced severe supernatural harassment. The curse also seemed to recognize the difference between legitimate archaeological investigation and tomb robbing for profit. Scholars who worked to understand and preserve Egyptian culture often experienced benevolent supernatural phenomena, including dreams that provided insights into ancient practices and mysterious assistance with their research. Dr. Salim Hassan, the Egyptian archaeologist who worked extensively in the Giza complex, reported numerous instances of supernatural guidance that helped him locate hidden chambers and understand the significance of ancient artifacts. Hassan attributed this assistance to the protective spirits of the ancient dead, who seemed to recognize his sincere desire to honor and preserve their cultural legacy. Similarly, several European archaeologists who approached their work with appropriate cultural sensitivity reported receiving supernatural protection and guidance that helped them avoid the dangers that claimed less respectful colleagues. These experiences suggest that the curse was not an indiscriminate force of destruction, but a complex spiritual mechanism designed to protect ancient Egyptian sacred sites from desecration while allowing legitimate scholarship to proceed. The reality of supernatural forces protecting Egyptian burial sites has implications that extend far beyond the specific cases of tomb excavations and museum hauntings. The consistent pattern of supernatural phenomena associated with Egyptian artifacts suggests that ancient religious beliefs and spiritual practices may have created protective mechanisms that continue to operate thousands of years after the civilization that created them has vanished. This possibility challenges fundamental assumptions about the nature of consciousness, spiritual energy, and the relationship between ancient religious practices and physical reality. If the Pharaohs' Curse represents a genuine supernatural phenomenon rather than coincidence and suggestion, then it suggests that human consciousness and spiritual intent can create effects that persist across millennia and continue to influence physical events in the modern world. The scientific implications of such a possibility are staggering, suggesting that consciousness and spiritual energy may be fundamental forces in the universe rather than mere byproducts of brain chemistry. The curse of the pharaohs may represent evidence for the reality of concepts that modern science has largely dismissed as superstition, including the persistence of consciousness after death and the ability of spiritual intention to influence physical reality. As you prepare for sleep tonight, consider the possibility that the ancient Egyptians, in their obsession with death and the afterlife, may have discovered spiritual truths that modern civilization has forgotten. Think about the thousands of years of accumulated spiritual energy that may still be protecting the pharaoh's eternal rest, and wonder whether our scientific worldview may be blind to forces that ancient peoples understood and respected. Let the mystery of the Pharaoh's Curse remind you that there are still aspects of reality that science cannot explain, still mysteries that challenge our understanding of what is possible in this universe. The ancient dead may not be as powerless as we assume, and the boundary between life and death may be more permeable than modern materialism suggests. Sleep peacefully, knowing that the protective forces of the ancient world watch over their sacred sites with vigilance that spans millennia, and that respect for the dead and their beliefs may be the best protection against supernatural forces that science cannot yet understand. The pharaohs sleep eternal in their golden tombs, but their spiritual guardians remain awake, ensuring that the sacred boundaries between the living and the dead are respected by all who would disturb their rest. In the silence of the desert night, the ancient gods still walk among their treasures, and the curse of the pharaohs continues to protect the eternal kingdom of the dead.